is a little off today. So let me stretch for a minute. Okay. This, once again, is an encore presentation of a talk that I first gave in the year 3 BC, which you know by now means before COVID. That seems a lot longer ago than it actually was. It was part of a series of talks on each of the 7 Unitarian Universalist principles. I am aware that the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UUA, is on the verge of replacing the current version of our principles. There's a couple of things about that. One, the proposed replacement in the UUA bylaws won't become official until at least this year's UUA General Assembly in June, so for now we have our current principles. Two, the proposed replacement on close reading is not inconsistent with or incompatible with our current principles. Mostly it's a restatement in different form. In any event, for at least a little longer, the principles as we've come to know them, and as they have stood since 1987, are still our principles. A couple of disclaimers. First, as I've said many times before, my only real qualification to speak to you is that I think about stuff a lot, some would say too much, often from unusual perspectives. I don't pretend to be an expert on the subjects I'm talking about. This is just one UU's viewpoint. My hope is simply to give you some things to ponder, to stimulate your own thinking, and maybe, just maybe, encourage you to act on that thinking. Second disclaimer, my own spiritual development has led me more and more down a Buddhist path, both in practice and in viewpoint. I don't consider this limiting in any way, quite the opposite, but I bring it up to let you know that I see the world more and more through a Buddhist lens. Part of that is that Buddhist practice breeds an appreciation of what Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing, the understanding that we exist not as independent entities, but as part of that interdependent web of our 7th principle, that our lives are interconnected in very complex ways and are in large part shaped by the circumstances in which we find ourselves. That realization breeds compassion toward others as surely as night follows day. I'd like to begin by simply going over the principles, which are listed in the front of the hymnal. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, which will be our topic today, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. I have found these principles, taken as a whole, to constitute a remarkably complete, self-consistent, and interlocking moral code. These principles were agreed upon by our association, not handed down to us as absolute law by a prophet or a deity. Thus, they constitute a living tradition that we can add to or clarify or update as the need arises, as the UUA is apparently on the verge of doing. As Unitarian Universalists, we don't have a creed, but we do have our principles, which are at the core of what it means to be a UU. And while there's plenty of room for interpretation of their precise meaning, according to this congregation's bylaws, a member of the congregation is expected to be in sympathy with these principles. The principles are not a belief system, rather they're a framework around which to build our individual belief systems, or a touchstone against which to test our beliefs. That is, if we find our beliefs to be in conflict with the principles, we need to take a close, hard look at those beliefs. For example, while we are each free to pursue our own search for truth and meaning, wherever that search leads us, to be authentic UUs, we need to reciprocate, to acknowledge that everyone else has that same freedom. And I repeated a paragraph here. what happens when you cut and paste talks. This assertion, and I have to look at which assertion. No, the one about re-examining our belief system. Lost track where I was there for a second. And I want to add a line that there are many paths to the spiritual mountaintop, but that doesn't mean that all paths lead there. And this assertion is going to figure into my exploration today of our third principle, that we affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. And hopefully I didn't add any duplicate paragraphs anywhere farther down here. Sorry about that. The wording of the principle is a little ambiguous. Does the phrase "in our congregations" apply only to encouragement to spiritual growth, or does it also apply to accept one another? I believe that it was meant to apply to both. Otherwise, encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations and acceptance of one another without that qualification would be two pretty much unrelated concepts that really don't go together as a single principle. So I'm going to assert right up front that the first and second principles are about the respect we should accord to all people, while the third principle was intended to be about how UUs should be in community with each other. What does acceptance mean in this context? I thought that would be a simple question to answer. I was wrong. It raised a related question that I thought would be easier to answer. What's the difference between tolerance and acceptance? I was wrong again, but I'll try. Usually we think of tolerance as putting up with something, even if we don't like it or we disapprove of it. The something we're putting up with could be a person, a group of people, a belief, an idea, or a situation. We think of acceptance as going a step beyond that, to approval of that something. So you can tolerate something without accepting it in general use, but you can't accept it without also tolerating it. So for example, in terms of how a heterosexual person relates to the LGBTQ community, to be tolerant might be to say, I don't care if someone's gay, and as long as they keep it to themselves and don't bother me with it, I won't bother them. But to be accepting is to say discrimination on the basis of sexual or gender orientation is just plain wrong, and I will stand with you or stand up for you against such discrimination. But there's such a wide variation in definitions and usage that tolerance and acceptance are often used almost as synonyms. Acceptance is actually more often used either in the sense of accepting a gift or an offer, or in the sense of resignation to a situation. I don't like it, but I have to accept it. Neither of which is what we're talking about here. Then in the sense of a step beyond just tolerance. Here are two definitions of tolerance from dictionary.com that I think actually describe acceptance in the way people usually think about it. I'm going to read the second one first, the one I don't like. A fair, objective, and permissive attitude toward opinions, beliefs, and practices that differ from one's own. And now the first one, which I find preferable. A fair, objective, and permissive attitude toward those whose opinions, beliefs, practices, racial or ethnic origins, etc., differ from one's own. Freedom from bigotry. There are two key differences between these definitions. First, there's a subtle but crucial distinction between your attitude toward opinions, beliefs, and practices and toward those who hold them, which suggests that maybe you can accept people who believe differently than you without agreeing that all their beliefs are valid. Second, there's the inclusion of fairness toward those with different racial or ethnic origins, etc. The etc. covers a lot of ground here. And the addition of the phrase freedom from bigotry. I'm highlighting these distinctions because it's not possible to accept all beliefs as valid, even if we recognize that our own beliefs may not be the best yardstick by which to measure other people's beliefs. You can't reconcile mutually exclusive beliefs. To accept all beliefs as valid is ultimately no different than accepting no beliefs as valid. But we can certainly respect other people and treat them fairly without bigotry, as the first and second principles call us to do, without having to agree with everything they believe. There's a mistaken notion held by a lot of non-UUs and even some UUs that because UUs don't have a creed, and perhaps because we encourage freedom of thought, that UUs can believe anything we want and that we are obligated to accept all viewpoints as valid. I have a fundamental issue with this notion that I find, at least according to Wikipedia, was first described by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945 in The Open Society and Its Enemies. This is Popper. Less well known is the paradox of tolerance. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the intolerant. There are counter-arguments to this, and we may indeed tolerate, in the common use of the word, though not accept, intolerance in the larger society, at least to some degree. But my point is that tolerance cannot be absolute. If a UU congregation, in the name of tolerance, accepts those with unapologetically intolerant views into its membership, they're now part of the society and it's no longer tolerant, especially if the intolerant become a majority. So if we are to remain a tolerant organization, there must be limits on our tolerance. Our tolerance for beliefs, that is, not for people. I know it's confusing, that's what makes it a paradox. What we need to remember when we talk about a tolerant society or organization is that the society is not an entity unto itself, not some sort of external framework that is imposed on us and controls us, ideally anyway, but rather is simply a collective name for the members who comprise it. A tolerant society can't be comprised of intolerant members. In other words, as an organization that espouses acceptance of others, we can only welcome as members those who are also willing to espouse acceptance of others, or we stop being an organization that espouses acceptance of others. To unwind the paradox a bit, it's not really a paradox to say that we are tolerant of everything but intolerance, because it's really a semantic issue. We're not using the terms tolerance and intolerance as direct opposites here. The tolerance that we espouse is not tolerance of all beliefs or ideas, but acceptance of and respect for people without regard for their race, ethnicity, national origin, age, gender, sexual orientation, or any of the other categories used to divide us. And what we are intolerant of is not people, but beliefs or ideas that are not compatible with our first and second principles. Granted, it can be challenging to separate intolerance of abhorrent beliefs and ideas from intolerance of the people who hold them. Now let's get back to the narrower question of what acceptance of one another in our congregations means. Of course, it includes the same freedom from bigotry we extend to everyone, but I think it goes beyond that. I feel that within our congregations we are expected to give each other the benefit of the doubt on our beliefs, so long as those beliefs are generally aligned with our UU principles, and to challenge them when we believe they aren't, which bleeds over into the responsible qualifier in the fourth principle. Not that we automatically accept that those beliefs are true or valid, but that we at least accept that they are sincerely held, and in some cases entertain the notion that they might be true, because we're almost always right, but not always. We really can't be who we aspire to be as a faith and accept blatantly exclusivist or exclusionary views within our ranks. But that said, there's always room to be more accepting by being a little more humble about our own notions, by recognizing that we all have different histories, experiences, and perspectives, that we aren't all at the same place or possibly not as far along on our journeys. If we disagree, it's just maybe possible that it's my view that contains biases that I'm not recognizing. You could be right, or for that matter, we could both be utterly wrong. And even when I don't accept your beliefs in their entirety, and really what two people, especially among UUs, where if you put two UUs in a room, you're going to get at least 3 opinions. What two people agree on everything? I can still accept that there might be some truth in your beliefs that might help me deepen my own understanding. Indeed, I wouldn't find a group of people who all think alike or believe alike to be very conducive to my spiritual growth. I'm a big fan of syncretism, that is, of cobbling together a spiritual system of belief, a worldview, by taking bits of truth from wherever I find them to create my own personal patchwork religion. Again, there are many paths to the spiritual mountaintop, and we can switch paths or carve a new one even, and we can help each other along even if our paths are not exactly the same. And again, we do have to be cautious not to assume that all paths lead up the mountain. They don't. Some beliefs are compatible with Unitarian Universalist principles and others are not. Just to illustrate that point, I'd like to do something a little different and throw in one of my favorite responsive readings here. We're not going to do it as a responsive reading because I'd rather you listen and digest these words than just recite them. And it's number 657 in the hymnal, It Matters What We Believe, by noted Unitarian religious education innovator Sophia Lyon-Foss. And I was really thankful that Jim and Cass did not choose this for the responsive reading this morning, but I would have done it again anyway. Some beliefs are like walled gardens. They encourage exclusiveness and the feeling of being especially privileged. Other beliefs are expansive and lead the way into wider and deeper sympathies. Some beliefs are like shadows, clouding children's days with fears of unknown calamities. Other beliefs are like sunshine, blessing children with the warmth of happiness. Some beliefs are divisive, separating the saved from the unsaved, friends from enemies. Other beliefs are bonds in a world community where sincere differences beautify the pattern. Some beliefs are like blinders, shutting off the power to choose one's own direction. Other beliefs are like gateways, opening wide vistas for exploration. Some beliefs weaken a person's selfhood. They blight the growth of resourcefulness. Other beliefs nurture self-confidence and enrich the feeling of personal worth. Some beliefs are rigid, like the body of death, impotent in a changing world. Other beliefs are pliable, like the young sapling, ever growing with the upward thrust of life. I think that to talk about encouragement to spiritual growth, we have to first decide what we mean by spiritual growth. And to do that, we have to decide what we mean by spirituality. I could spend a week or two on this, but because unfortunately, spirituality is an even harder concept to pin down than tolerance, or than acceptance rather. The very first line of the Wikipedia article in spirituality is, "There is no single widely agreed definition of spirituality." No kidding. The article goes on to say, a survey of reviews by McCarroll et al. Dealing with the topic of spirituality gave 27 explicit definitions, among which, quote, "there was little agreement," unquote. But some years ago, here we rather serendipitously had several nearly consecutive Sunday sermons on the topic of spirituality. Not surprisingly, it turned out to mean completely different things to different people. In our talkback discussion after one of those talks, we were asked to share what we considered to be spiritual experiences. There were a wide range of examples offered, involving art, music, nature, congregational fellowship, religious epiphanies, meditative insights, etc. Finally, one of our members observed that, to her, what these experiences all had in common was that in one way or another, they involved a feeling of connectedness to something greater than ourselves. I really like that as a general definition, and I've used it ever since. Spirituality is a sense of connection to a larger whole. It doesn't require a religious or supernatural belief, although it certainly encompasses those. In other words, the phrase spiritual but not religious is not an oxymoron. In that view, then, spiritual growth is a process of discovering and deepening your sense of connectedness to humanity, to the earth, to the universe, to a metaphysical or transcendental reality, by whatever path works for you. It need not be tied to a particular religious or supernatural belief, or to any religious or supernatural belief at all. It's possible to develop a deep appreciation of your place in the interdependent web of our seventh principle from a completely secular perspective. With this view of spirituality as connectedness, beliefs or paths that inhibit our spiritual growth would be those that tend to divide us from each other, thus conflicting with our sixth principle, or those that separate us from the larger reality in which we find ourselves, thus conflicting with our seventh principle. The nature of spiritual growth in Unitarian Universalism is fundamentally different than in a creedal faith. In a Christian church, for example, spiritual growth might consist primarily of Bible study sessions aimed at deepening one's understanding of the Christian scriptures, or at least of a particular interpretation of them, but is unlikely to include much exploration of other religious traditions. In our tradition, however, we are encouraged to look far and wide to explore those sources listed in our hymnal and anywhere else that there might be a nugget of spiritual truth. We are more about breadth than depth. One way we encourage spiritual growth in a UU congregation is simply by providing each other the opportunity to flourish. Another is by sharing our own experiences. Many here have bravely shared our experiences, encouraging others to do the same, and we all learn from each other. We don't tell each other what to believe, we show where we've been and share what works for us or doesn't, in the hope that others might glean something helpful from our experiences. Exposure to many viewpoints, stories, and traditions allows us to compare and contrast, to find connections between different spiritual paths, and we can occasionally help each other avoid wandering astray on paths that, from our own experience, don't lead to the mountaintop. I've always felt that if you have found a path that works for you, the best thing you can do to invite others to share it is to teach by example, not to try to tell them what they should do or believe. Which brings me back around to my earlier assertion that what the third principle is about is how UUs are to be in community with each other. We're called to accept each other as the beautiful individuals we are and to encourage and support each other in our individual spiritual journeys. We had a discussion group meeting some years ago, actually, for which the opening words, the only thing I remember from that particular discussion group, written by retired UU minister Penny Hackett Evans, described UU community beautifully. Each of us brings a separate truth here. We bring the truth of our own life, our own story. We don't come as empty vessels, but rather we come as full people, people who have a story and our own truth. We seek to add to our stories. This room is rich with truth, rich with experience. All manner of people are here, needy, joyful, frightened, anxious, bored. We all bring our truth with us. May we all recognize the truth and the story in everyone's life. And may we hear and honor the truths that we all bring as we gather together. Together we have truths, together we have a story, together we are a community. As a community, a UU congregation isn't some fixed, predefined entity that you agree to conform to when you join. It's a living, changing organism that is defined by its members within the overall framework of our principles, And when you join, you're one of those members, and you get to help define it. This privilege, of course, comes with some responsibility. As I argued earlier, seemingly paradoxically, we put ourselves forth as a tolerant community. And so we really can't tolerate intolerance within our community. But we also have to approach this lovingly. Not everybody in a UU community is at the same place in their journey or as far along. Not everybody has the same vantage point. The best way we can combat intolerance within our communities is to point it out, not angrily or self-righteously, but lovingly and patiently, and probably more importantly, do our best to set a good example. Assume that someone who seems intolerant of others has good intentions, but either is unaware of the issue or is doing their best to work on it. Or just perhaps it's our perception of their position that's askew. And be willing to address the hidden biases and blind spots in your own worldview as they come up. We all have them. It comes with being human. To close out, I'd like to summarize my main observations. First, once again, the third principle, that we covenant to affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, tells us how we as UU should be in relationship, in loving community with each other. Accepting others in this context, to me, doesn't mean that we have to approve of every belief or opinion that they hold, but that we appreciate them for who they are and what they bring to the table, treat them with respect, and welcome them into our community. Second, no, UUs can't believe anything we want, and no, UUs don't have to accept all viewpoints as valid. There are many spiritual paths and belief systems that are compatible with the UU principles, maybe as many as there are UUs, maybe even a few more. But importantly, that's not the same as saying that all paths or beliefs are valid. There are indeed many paths that lead up the mountain, but there are a whole lot that don't. The paradox of tolerance points out that if you belong to a group governed by its members, and that group espouses tolerance, then logically, to be a member of the group, you have to espouse tolerance, and your beliefs should be compatible with that. Third, spirituality is hard to pin down, but I define it very generally as anything that makes you feel more connected to something outside yourself. Indeed, anything that blurs the perceived boundary between yourself and everything else. Spiritual growth is anything that moves you closer to that sense of connectedness. Within our congregations, we encourage spiritual growth by sharing our own views and experiences with each other, and by not restricting spiritual exploration to a single direction, for example, to a particular tradition or philosophy or set of scriptures. Finally, as self-governing communities in covenantal relationship with each other and with the UUA, our congregations are what we make them, which is both an opportunity and a responsibility. You're in this together. As a member of such a community, please seek both to learn from other members and to give them the opportunity to learn from you. As always, life's hard, so help each other through it and try to leave the world at least a little better than you found it. May the road rise up to meet you